Well, hey, welcome to Theology Matters Thursday, where we look at frequently asked biblical and theological questions. Today's question actually comes in about a specific verse in the New Testament from the book of Colossians, chapter 1 and verse 15. In that passage, it refers to Jesus as being the firstborn over all creation. And this is an especially important verse during this time of year where we celebrate the birth of Jesus and him coming to this world. And so we read a passage like that, and it's confusing. What does that really mean that Jesus was the firstborn of all creation? You know, the question is there because that seems to imply, at first glance, that means that Jesus was the first one that was created over everything. And if that is true, if Jesus was a created being by God, well, then he cannot be God, because you can't be God if you were, in fact, created. And this is actually what several popular religions in America believe, what Mormonism teaches, what Jehovah's Witnesses believe, that Jesus was a created being. He was the firstborn created being. And so they often use this passage to argue that. Well, let's look at the passage in question and then try to understand it. Here's what it says, Colossians 1, 15 through 18. We'll just read the whole thing. For the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and earth, visible, invisible, thrones, powers, rulers, or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. Now, what's important to understand in order to understand this passage is this word right here, firstborn. It's a very important word to understand. The New Testament was written in the Greek language, and in Greek, firstborn there is the word prototokos. And here's very simply what it's important to understand. That word most often does not mean firstborn in a literal sense, or the first one created, but it means first in rank. It means supreme. Now, there are times in the New Testament where it does mean firstborn. The one place where it means that literally, referring to Jesus actually, is Luke chapter 2 and verse 7. It talks about Mary giving birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son. That's prototokos there, referring to Jesus. And there it does mean literally Jesus was her firstborn son. But every other place that word is used in the Bible, or most other places, it's not actually referring literally to the firstborn son, but figuratively to first in rank. Here's just a few examples. In the Old Testament, starting there, Jeremiah 31:9, God says, because I am Israel's father, and Ephraim is my firstborn son. Well, in fact, Ephraim wasn't literally the firstborn son. Manasseh was, and yet Ephraim is referred to as the firstborn son because he was first in rank. Exodus chapter 4:22, same thing. The Lord says to Pharaoh, hey, don't mess with Israel. They are my firstborn son. Now, obviously, Israel wasn't the literal first son of God. He's referring to them in their rank over all nations. And then maybe most powerfully in Psalm 89:7, talking about King David, God says, I will appoint him to be my firstborn, the most exalted king of the earth. And he's talking about King David there and how he is appointing him to be the firstborn. And so obviously he's not referring to any literal sense there. And then in the New Testament, we see all these other passages here. You can take time to look those up where it is referring to firstborn as Jesus, not in the literal firstborn sense, but in rank as supreme. And maybe most simply the best way to understand it is if that word literally meant firstborn or first created, there is a different Greek word that the Apostle Paul could have used. That is prototistos. That's a whole separate word, and that means the first one created. But he didn't use that word. He used prototokos, which means supreme, firstborn overall. And so I think it's important to remember this, that Jesus, as the firstborn, it doesn't mean that he was the first one created literally, but it does mean that he is supreme over all things, and we should remember that, including our lives. And so make that your prayer this week, that Jesus truly would be supreme in your life over everything.